Ho, ho, ho. Santa here from the IFSQN. Welcome to edition 60 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. The bad news is it's the final Food Safety Fridays of 2016, hence this outfit under, yes, it is me. If you've not guessed, it's Simon Timperley. Today we have Earl Arnold with us. Earl is subject matter expert food defense at AIB International, and Earl's going to be talking about vulnerability assessment for intentional contamination. So we're looking forward to that shortly. Just to say, today's webinar, as always, is sponsored by FSSC 22000, Metal of Toledo, and Safe Food 360 and Trace Analytics, our proud sponsors, and help to bring these free of charge to you, help you get some education and a free certificate, and have done so throughout the year. So very, very big thanks to our sponsors. At this point, I'd like to welcome our guest, Earl Arnold. Hi, Earl, how are you doing?
Good, Simon. Thank you for inviting me, and hello, everybody from everywhere, it looks like.
Yeah, I can see you taking it really seriously today.
I try. Merry Christmas, everybody.
And you're dialing in from today, Earl?
Today I'm dialing in from Austin, Texas.
Yeah, and where it's snowing really heavily and the reindeer are trotting around. Is that correct?
Definitely. The temperature is supposed to get as high as 70 degrees or 21 centigrade.
Excellent. Okay, Earl, while you get your presentation ready, I'll just have a little chat with the audience and I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simon.
Okay, ladies and gents, for those of you who have not joined one of the webinars before, it's your first time, I'd just like to direct you to the sidebar on the right-hand side. You can see there chat, room, polls, etc. Please feel free to type in your comments, say hello, Merry Christmas, season greetings to each other, type in your questions. We'll pick them up at the end. So do that. We'll have some polls throughout also, so we want you to take part in that. Also, today's webinar is being recorded as ever. So within 24 hours, we always send an email to all registrants with the certificate of attendance, with the presentation slides, and with the webinar recording. So you want me to take it off? Fashion statement has been made. Okay, I will do. Yeah, just bear with me. I'll be back for the Q&A later. Without the disguise. I know you want to see my handsome face. So, but for now, we'll head over to Earl. Over to you, Earl.
All right, thank you, Simon. Again, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, depending upon where you're at. Today, we're going to talk about vulnerability assessments for food facilities. Just a little information about my organization, AIB International. We were founded in 1919 as a technology and information transfer center for bakers and food processors. Our current mission is to empower clients worldwide to elevate their food safety and production process capabilities by developing and delivering application-oriented learning, consulting, and value-added services. Our headquarters is located in Manhattan, Kansas, and we have experts on staff that deals with the production of baking, cereal science, nutrition, food safety and hygiene, and obviously food defense. A little bit of history about myself is, again, my name is Earl Arnold. I'm the global manager here at AIB International for the Food Safety Modernization Act and food defense, and I'm located in Austin, Texas. A little bit of history about myself. I joined AIB about 2 years ago. Prior to joining AIB, I served in the U.S. Army for 23 years. 15 years of that was as a military food inspector manager, where some of the things that we did was we inspected all food that came into a military installation for contractual and specification requirements. We also conducted sanitary inspections for all food facilities on an installation. We also conducted audits on food facilities, civilian food facilities that wanted to do business with the Department of Defense. And last but not least, we conducted all the food vulnerability assessments for every food establishment on a military installation. And we did those annually. Currently, I serve as lead instructor for our food defense seminars. I write and present on food defense issues. I'm lead instructor qualified for the Preventative Controls for Human Food rule. I'm HACCP certified, and I conduct many more instructional seminars for AIB. So jumping into the presentation, one of the first things that you want to do before you determine, before you begin your vulnerability assessment is, one, what type of vulnerability assessment are you going to address? And two, what are you wanting to protect? To give you an idea of that, the FDA has created a new regulation. It's the first time a regulation's been created for intentional adulteration, and it was in response to the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, the regulation only asks you to look at intentional adulteration on a large scale, and you also need to consider that it could be done by somebody we welcomed into our facility. Now, again, that's all the regulation asks for. But what might be important to you is also protecting your employees, your visitors and contractors that visit your facility, your products, and not just on a large scale, but you also might want to look at smaller versions of potential intentional adulteration. You also might want to look at and protect assets like power supplies and water mains. And again, last but not least, and I'm sure this is very important to you, brand protection. How much is your brand worth to you? So once you've determined the type of vulnerability assessment you're going to do and what you want to protect, your next step you want to do is to determine what type of threats you have that you need to develop your vulnerability assessment against. The threat assessment evaluates potential aggressors and damages caused by vandalism, break-ins within the area, and the assessment can also identify the tactics that's used by those aggressors. When doing a threat assessment, you also might want to consider a complete spectrum of threats, such as environmental, power loss, and even water interruptions. So to get a good threat assessment completed, you might need to know where you can get these sources of information. So the first place you might want to consider is your local law enforcement or police. What you might want to do in order to get this information is invite these individuals into your facilities. Allow them to tour your facilities so that they have a good idea of the lay of the land. There you can talk with them about your security concerns and security issues that might be relevant to your community. Getting their expert advice could help you develop your programs even further. Additionally, you can reach out to your suppliers. Just like you, your suppliers are knowledge experts on their products, just like you are on yours. So getting them to assist you in developing potential vulnerabilities for ingredients that you receive from them could be beneficial. And last but not least, there's also additional databases and other resources that you can go to help you develop a good threat assessment, such as capindex.com, citydata.com, and Family Watchdog. So again, these are great website resources that you can get statistics on crimes and threats that might be of concern to you in your facilities. So once you've determined your threat assessment and what threats might be potential for your facilities, you now want to begin what I call preliminary steps in developing your vulnerability assessment. And the first one I would like to discuss is a facility description. So a facility description have been used in the past and are provided in some HACCP plans, but it might be useful to include them in your food safety plan, but it's not a regulatory requirement. But this is also true for food defense. However, including this information in your food defense plan can be beneficial, and we'll discuss those things as you see on the slide. So the first one is the type of materials. The type of materials could be considered on why some identified vulnerabilities either need to be mitigated or do not need to be mitigated. So for an example, if my building is made out of tin, someone could easily cut through, and this might be a reason why I include an area or a process as having a vulnerability that requires mitigation. However, if my building is made of concrete, that would obviously make it more difficult for someone to break in, and so that could justify why I do not need a certain type of mitigation for an identified vulnerability. Another indicator that might be considered on our facility description is size. So size can help us explain why a vulnerability has been identified and either require mitigation or not. So if I have one small building to consider when conducting my vulnerability assessment, it allows me to make easier decisions in mitigating management strategies. However, if I have a large facility or a campus-style facility where I have multiple buildings, then obviously it could be a little bit more difficult, and I might need to include other things when I'm doing my mitigation strategies. And then also taking a look at security considerations. So including security considerations in my facility description, like the types of signs I'm employing around my facility, like my weapons policy signs or no trespassing signs, or my designated employee sign entrances or visitor entrances, even including that I'm using CCTV cameras in my areas and the types of alarms that I have on my doors and windows. All of these things in my facility description can help explain and justify why I'm considering vulnerabilities or not. Last thing to discuss is the location of my facility. So you might also want to consider neighboring properties as well. So if I'm located in a rural area where it's really difficult to find my facility because it's away from major roads, my security concerns might be a little bit different than if I have a facility that's located in the middle of a large metropolitan area. So considering factors such as traffic flow, congestion, and even special events in and around these areas could affect my security concerns or potential vulnerabilities. So next, we're going to talk about the next step, which is a product description. Now, I know product descriptions are also things that are used in HACCP and food safety plans and have been in there for relevant things to back up scientific information. But it's also a good thing maybe to include for food defense purposes. What I mean by this is listing down food safety characteristics like pH, water activity level, or even preservatives. When I'm doing my vulnerability assessment and considering potential contaminants, we'll say biological. If I'm worried about potentially salmonella or E. coli being intentionally adulterating my product, such things as preservatives, or if my product has a high acidic level, that could be a good determining justifying measure of why I do not need to consider a biological agent as a contaminant because I have protective measures in place. Additionally, on product descriptions, you also want to consider your intended and unintended use and your customers. Now, primarily, I select customers because if your primary customers are individuals that have compromised immune systems, such as infants or young children, elderly persons, pregnant women, or immunosuppressed persons. So what I mean by this is if my customers are strictly hospitals or elementary schools, then my food defense measures might need to be a little bit more robust than if my customers are just the general public. The next preliminary step that I want to talk about is flow diagrams. So flow diagrams are a potential significant tool, and it's going to be one of your most highly useful preliminary steps that will assist you in identifying if a process step is vulnerable. So in the past, when we've done vulnerability assessments, most of our things have been focused on preventing bad people from getting into our facilities, like having perimeter fences, barbed wire on the top of our fences, security cameras or lights, or access into our facility being limited, like with key cards and such. The regulatory requirement from the FDA and even some of the new GFSI scoped audits are also asking you to look at your process steps on the inside of your facility to see if those areas are vulnerable to intentional adulteration as well. So the best way to capture this new best practice or recommended strategy for regulation is to look at your flow chart. You want to ensure that your flow diagram covers every single process in your facility, beginning at receiving all of your ingredients, your packaging, and all your raw materials to the completion of your product and its shipping out of your facility. Once you are sure that your flow diagram is complete, then you want to make sure that you verify that it is correct. And the best way to do this is to walk your flow diagram once it's completed. Developing this flow diagram and then describing each of your process steps is crucial in developing your vulnerability assessment and potential mitigation strategies. It can assist you and your team in identifying those areas that might be vulnerable to intentional adulteration. So once you've developed your flow diagram, now you want to do a short description on your processes. So you do not need to write out your policies. If your policies are going to be included as a process description, you can just reference them. But you want to capture your relevant food defense issues that are on them. So for instance, if I am looking at my process step of receiving a raw ingredient, do I have any areas that I need to be worried about? Is that access area controlled? Do I have sensitive equipment that could be around the area? Do I use CCTV cameras to monitor potential activity? All of these things are considered, or what you want to consider when you're describing your process in dealing with food defense. Now we're going to talk about the vulnerability assessment itself. Again, a vulnerability assessment requires you to identify, quantify, and prioritize the process steps of a facility. You need to ensure that you evaluate each individual process step within the production process, and you want to identify those steps with the greatest risk of intentional adulteration, and if a vulnerability has been identified at one of these steps, and it requires mitigation strategies to significantly reduce or prevent the potential vulnerability from occurring. This would be what the FDA terms as an actionable process step. And it needs to specify, and this vulnerability assessment needs to be specific to each and every facility. If you have multiple facilities in your company, you don't want to do a general vulnerability assessment. You want it to be specific to each facility because obviously things happen different at each one. So like I mentioned before, you want to make that decision on how you will approach your vulnerability assessment. Do you want to just meet or regulatory guidelines, or do you want to include best practices or what's in your best interest of your company? Or do you want to have separate programs? So you want to make this decision, and it allows you to choose your best type of assessment that you want to do. The ones that we're going to talk about are the new type of assessment that's required in the regulation, which is a HACCP style type assessment. We're also going to discuss the operational risk management type assessment, and also, last but not least, the CARVER plus shock assessment. But these are not the only ones. These are just the three that we're going to talk about. The USDA has their own versions, and I'm sure like almost every country out there that's listening, your countries have recommended food defense vulnerability assessments for your programs too as well. But first, before we jump into the remainder of the webinar, we're going to talk about our first poll. So the question is, what FDA regulation governs intentional adulteration? Is it 21 Code of Federal Regulation 117, or 21 CFR 110, 21 CFR 121, or 21 CFR 112?
Okay, I've set the poll in the sidebar. Question, what FDA regulation governs intentional adulteration? 21 CFR Code of Federal Regulation 117, 21 CFR 110, 21 CFR 121, or 21 CFR 112. So let's see how clever our audience are today. Okay, the favorites are 21 CFR Code of Federal Regulation 117 and 21 CFR 121. A few for, well, 15% for 110 and 7% for 112. So, Earl, put us out of our misery.
So the correct answer is the 21 Code of Federal Regulation 121.
Great. Well, actually, 41%, the majority voted for that. So well done, everybody.
That is excellent.
Okay, moving on.
All right. So when discussing the regulatory assessment, like we just learned, 21 Code of Federal Regulation 121, mitigation strategies to protect food against intentional adulteration, it requires a HACCP style assessment, and it must be written, and you need to describe or justify why each processing step is or not considered an actionable process step. What that basically means is, have I identified a potential vulnerability at that processing step? If I have, and it requires mitigation, then that's what the FDA considers as an actionable process step. So while assessing whether each contaminant is a hazard, and we're going to talk about those contaminants later on in this webinar, this assessment needs to be conducted by a qualified individual, meaning that they've had training and education in how to conduct this type of vulnerability assessment. in examining their processes for significant vulnerabilities. These three elements need to be considered in the assessment. So the potential for public health impact, severity and scale of a potential adulterant if a contaminant were added, the degree of a physical access to that product or that process step, and last but not least, the ability of an aggressor to contaminate product. And you also need to consider, again, that that individual that's doing this might be someone that we've welcomed into our facility. Now, this is the FDA regulatory requirement. The USDA requirements are similar in nature and even provides links to some of FDA's resources to use in doing their assessments. Again, this is one of the major new things that the new regulation from the FDA is asking us to do if we need to meet this regulatory requirement. The next type of assessment that we're going to talk about is the operational risk management assessment. If you are exempted from the regulation, or if you want to include other items of concern, you might want to consider an operational risk management assessment. This is a 6-step sequence to increase operational effectiveness by anticipating hazards and reducing the potential for loss. The 6 steps include identifying the hazard, and I'll go through and give examples. So if I'm looking at, say, we'll say bulk liquid receiving. If I had, what would be a hazard that I might be identifying might be that I want to make sure somebody was not able to add a contaminant before this tanker of bulk liquid came to my facility. So that's my hazard I'm worried about, somebody contaminating it. So I'm going to assess my risks. What are my risks? Well, if somebody were adding a contaminant, how severe would that be? It could be life-threatening. It could lead to deaths. So I would say that that would be considered a high risk or a high hazard. Now, what's the likelihood or probability of that happening before I implement any type of controls? Well, if I don't have any controls, it could be easy to do, so I might consider that a high. So now, when I've identified those hazards in my risk level, I now need to go on to step 3, which is analyzing potential risk control measures. So what type of controls can I put in that can reduce that risk level down? So it might be, well, I'm going to ask those people to put locks on all open hatches or security seals so that I can determine that when they were sealed at the facility, that it's those same seals when it comes to my facility. And I can think of all different type of control measures. And then step 4 is I'm going to make the best one that's going to significantly reduce that down to a minimal risk level. And then step 5 is I'm going to implement those controls, write out my policies and procedures on how I'm going to control it. And then my last step is I'm going to supervise and I'm going to continually to review this process just in case new things don't come up. Operational risk management is a good assessment tool that can be used in developing a good vulnerability assessment. Now we're going to talk about the third assessment type that, that is on our webinar, and it's called the CARVER plus shock method. So the CARVER plus shock method was an assessment that was created by the U.S. military. It was specifically for special forces to conduct assessments on operations and include shock in the assessment. This assessment has been utilized by the FDA and USDA in conducting multiple assessments on the whole food safety systems from farm to fork, as well as individual facilities. This type of assessment is time consuming in developing, however, you get very detailed results. Now, the FDA and the USDA did use these, and some of you might recall that in the proposed rule for this new regulation, they had stated that there were 4 key activity types that might be able to be utilized in doing or conducting a vulnerability assessment. Well, they determined those 4 key activity types by conducting the CARVER plus shock assessment. And it identified those 4 areas that was the most significant potential for intentional adulteration, which was bulk liquid receiving, bulk liquid storage, raw ingredient storage, and last but not least, mixing and blending areas. And that's how they were able to develop those 4 key activity types. The goal of the CARVER plus shock assessment is to identify those critical nodes that are the most likely targets for an aggressor to create intentional adulteration events. And The assessment allows you to design shields to reduce the risk. CARVER plus shock results in targeting conclusions that are consistent with the high-risk vulnerabilities identified by an ORM type assessment, and it augments it because the process also allows the identification for the economic or physiological impact for the entire system in our facilities. So now we reach the point where we have one more question for the poll. And the question is, a vulnerability assessment should consider the probability or likelihood of an identified vulnerability happening and the severity if the identified vulnerability should occur. Is this true or false?
Okay, simply, there is no button to press. Simply type true or false in the chat bar, please. So the question again, a vulnerability assessment should consider the probability or likelihood of an identified vulnerability happening and the severity if the identified vulnerability should occur. And we're looking at a long list of truths.
Simon, you have a very smart audience because that is absolutely correct. The answer is true. You need to consider both of these in an assessment.
Right. Okie dokie. Yes, let's move on.
All righty. So next, we're going to talk about potential hazards or contaminants that you need to consider in your vulnerability assessment. Again, whether you're doing the regulatory requirement or best entrance or best practices on the CARVER plus shock or operational risk management form, you want to consider these potential hazards as being the intentional adulterant that could be used. And so we're going to talk about these specifically. So for biological hazards or contaminants, they are agents or organisms or toxins that can kill or incapacitate people, livestock, and crops. But there are others, such as anthrax spores, that could be very long-lived. Biological agents are very difficult to grow and maintain as they break down quickly when exposed to the environment. But like we mentioned, anthrax is one of those that can be long-lived, and I have an example. So around May 27th of 2015, the Department of Defense made a public announcement that they had accidentally sent live anthrax through the U.S. postal mail to 5 different labs located in the U.S. was to send inactivated anthrax by putting it through a sterilization process before shipping it. The sterilization process was followed. However, it did not work and was not sufficient enough to make the anthrax inactive. The reason the anthrax was sent through the mail is that the Department of Defense wanted to test the postal system to determine if the established protocols would work in detecting biological agents if they were sent through the mail. So another example of how hardy anthrax can be was on October 15th in 2001, and most of you probably are aware of this, anthrax was sent through the mail to the Senate building in the United States. One of the aides of Senator Daschle opening up this letter and exposed anthrax to the environment. So besides Senator Daschle's suite, 11 other offices in the Hart building was superficially contaminated as well. The building was decontaminated, but it cost around $27 million to do so. So again, biological agents can be used as a contaminant, and here's a good example of one that's kind of hardy and potentially could survive. But some common types that might be used is anthrax, smallpox, bubonic plague, botulism toxin, and even Q fever. So chemical contaminants can also be applied in different forms, such as gas, liquid, aerosol, or even powder form. Some additional things you might want to consider is a chemical contaminant is also a food formula additive if it's added in excess of what our required formulas require. And also you want to take a look at allergens can be used as a chemical adulterant. So if you have allergens in your facility, and we have some products that require allergens and other products that do not contain those allergens, this could be a potential vulnerability that may require mitigation strategies, because how we handle allergens in our facility, we might want to look at that a little bit different in food defense perspective, because this might be an easily accessible adulterant that can be utilized to create intentional adulteration. So physical. So physical contaminants are basically anything. It could be glass, wood, metal, bone shavings. We do have some measures in place in most of our facilities that we use for food safety purposes that can be an assistance in preventing these things from happening. Like sifters, metal detectors, filters, these kind of things can weed out these potential adulterants that could be utilized. However, we still want to be diligent about considering these as potential hazards. The last one on the list, radiological. So this one is usually a not best choice for people to utilize as an adulterant, but it's still something you want to consider. There are sources that are available for people to pick up and use as an adulterant, such as maybe contaminated soil from Fukushima or Chernobyl, those type of areas. Additionally, they can obtain these sources from medical waste, medical equipment, and even some food manufacturing equipment has small radiological isotopes that are utilized to run the equipment. So again, these are the types of hazards that you might want to consider when evaluating your facilities for potential hazards. Now we're going to get into talking about assessing the risk. So when conducting a vulnerability assessment, we need to establish the definition of what risk is in our facility, and what that means for our facility. So the best way to do this is to cross-reference severity, what would happen if the hazard should occur, with probability on how often this vulnerability or hazard could occur before we've implemented our control measures. Severity is the only thing that once we've established will not change, or basically we cannot change. If we are worried about salmonella as being an intentional adulterant and we've determined that the severity would be catastrophic if we utilized it or if it was implemented, then nothing we can do is going to offset that from being catastrophic. The only thing that we're going to be able to control is the probability or likelihood of it occurring. So on here, you want to define what these terms mean for you and your facility. The ones that I have up on the screen right now, like for instance, catastrophic as being a complete business failure or maybe resulting in death, you want to establish your own versions of what these terms mean so that when you're doing your vulnerability assessment, you can share with either regulators or with your customers on how you evaluated risk and hazards in your facility as related to food defense. So next, we're talking about the probability or likelihood. Again, when conducting the assessment, you want to establish your definitions for here too as well. These are just examples. Like you can see for seldom I've listed down it may occur in a career or occur seldom in a population. These are just examples of potential definitions. You want to establish your own definitions for what these things mean for your facility before you begin your assessment. And again, you take these considerations of whether you're doing your assessment based on regulatory requirements or if you're including your best interest or best practices. Again, these these reasons for your vulnerability assessment will also play an important role on how you define probability or likelihood and severity. But when developing your vulnerability assessment, probability or likelihood is where more than likely, when you do establish mitigation strategies, this is where your control measures are going to play an important role in limiting or preventing this from happening. So once we've identified definitions of severity and probability, now we can use the risk matrix, and when we're looking at a potential hazard, we can now cross-reference it, determine our overall risk level. So for instance, if we take a look at this chart, and I'm again using the same example of salmonella as being can relate to death and as being catastrophic, I would do that as extremely high. And if I think that it was probably going to be seldom or unlikely to occur, if I cross-reference, my overall risk level would be, we'll say, high. So it's still a considerable risk where I might need to consider mitigation strategies, but this now can demonstrate how I've established risk for a potential vulnerability, and if I need to develop mitigation strategies to either significantly reduce or prevent that vulnerability from happening. What we have on the screen now is an example of a vulnerability assessment that potentially could be used to capture the regulatory requirement of a vulnerability assessment. As we mentioned before, we had the three elements that we need to capture: the public health impact, physical access, and ability to contaminate, and also a spite to put down processing step or ingredients that we're going to assess, and the vulnerability identified as being biological, chemical, physical, or radiological. Again, this is only an example of a potential vulnerability assessment that we can use to meet the potential regulatory requirement, but it is not like a infinite, definite, this is the only one you can use. Additionally, if you're not required to follow or don't want to follow the regulatory requirement so that we can include others, again, we can use a similar type of information in the ORM or even the CARVER plus shock method assessment. So again, just one example. What I want to do is a good way to use this form. We'll go back and use the bulk liquid processing step as a way to go through this. I would write that down as my processing step, bulk liquid receiving, and then for my vulnerability identified, I would consider biological contaminants. I would consider potential chemical contaminants being added. I might not consider physical. And the reason why I say this is even though physical contaminants might be able to be added, there are already systems in place when I'm unloading that bulk liquid container that might prevent physical from getting into my product when it gets into my storage tank, such as screens and filters. So I might not consider physical. And radiological is still a factor you might want to consider. Again, you'll take that evaluation based off of your assessment. But now, once I've identified potential vulnerabilities or hazards, I now move on to what is the public health impact if that type of contaminant were to be added. And I would go back to my cross-reference and assess likelihood and probability on my public health impact and get my risk level, high, medium, low, whatever it might be. And then I would do the same thing with my physical access. I would assess that and my ability to contaminate. And after I've filled that information on, if I have identified significant vulnerabilities, I now would put in either yes, mitigation is needed, or no, it is not, and I would justify my decisions. And once I've done that, then I would implement a brief idea of how I'm going to mitigate that potential vulnerability. Like for in this instance, if I'm worried about intentional contaminant being added, I might say include to make sure that there's padlocks or seals on all openings prior to receiving it at my facility. Again, just an example of how to run through the vulnerability assessment using this type of an example. So now, if I've identified a vulnerability and we need to develop mitigation strategies, we want to be able to identify potential resources that can help us in developing our mitigation strategies. One of them is the FDA's Food Defense Mitigation Strategies database. It's a tool designed to assist with identifying preventative measures, and it provides a range of mitigation strategies. So if you log on to the FDA's website, you can go to this database, and once you open it, you can input any processing step like bulk liquid receiving, and you hit enter, and it gives you a ton of lists of potential mitigation strategies for almost all vulnerabilities that might be associated with it. Again, it's not saying that those are the only mitigation strategies that you can use, but it gives you ideas if you're kind of stumped and need assistance in doing some brainstorming to develop mitigation strategies. We can even use partial. We can combine some that we observe. We can even make ones all on our own. Again, it's just a useful tool. Another useful tool is the Food Defense Risk Mitigation tool of the USDA. It can help you identify possible countermeasures to potential mitigation strategies, and it allows you to include a specific node like a processing step, and it gives others that are more general. Again, these are just two recommended tools if we're struggling on how to develop our mitigation strategies. So our requirements are we need to identify and implement whatever mitigation strategies we need to do. We need to do it at each process step that we've identified potential vulnerabilities. And then once we've developed them, we have to write out our process or our descriptions of how we're going to control that mitigation and prove that it's going to significantly minimize or prevent that vulnerability from happening. So once we've decided our mitigation strategy and whatever it's going to be, we now need to monitor it to make sure that it's effective and working appropriately. So the first thing is the elements of monitoring. So you want to, in monitoring, ensure that you document how often that you need to do this event and how often it will be conducted, who's going to conduct that event, and also within that, making sure that individual is trained so that they are sure on what to do and how to do it appropriately and how to record it. And then how is that monitoring going to be accomplished? And we'll use the same example we've been using, which is identifying seals on our all opening ports. So it might be that we're verifying the seals are the exact ones put on and are exactly written on the shipping documents and matching those. And then we write down that we checked them. And then we want to also include what is going to be monitored. Another thing that we need to address is if we have developed a mitigation strategy and we are going to monitor it, what happens if there's a failure? So what happens if there isn't a seal present, or what happens if the seal doesn't match the shipping documents if that's our mitigation strategy? So we want to develop corrective actions on what to do if we need to address a deviation. Now, if you're doing the regulatory type of an assessment, the FDA has basically said that they understand that corrective actions are going to be flexible. They're only going to be developed that are required as appropriate to the nature of your vulnerability that you've identified and the nature of your mitigation strategy. And they expect that in most cases that your corrective action is going to be simple. For instance, we'll say if we identified a vulnerable area of, say, a mixing tank in our processing facility, and we said it had to have a lock on it. And maybe we were doing our inspections and it didn't have a lock on it. Well, a potential corrective action could be that we're going to put the lock on it. We're going to do an investigation to make sure that there was no intentional adulteration. And then it might go back to retraining and educating our personnel on why it's important to make sure that we put the locks on when we say we're supposed to. Again, just examples of what it means by our corrective actions will probably be flexible and simple. We also need to verify and demonstrate that monitoring is being conducted as we've written it in our procedure or policy. We also need to verify that when corrective actions are conducted or needed, that they were done appropriately to make sure that there was no gap in our food defense plan. And our mitigation strategies are working effectively to significantly reduce or prevent those vulnerabilities. So verification requires us to review our monitoring documents and show that we reviewed them for correct actions, and also reviewing our corrective action records to make sure that everything was done appropriately. And then not only verifying our monitoring documents, but we also want to verify our food defense plan as a whole. We want to reanalyze that as well to make sure that our food defense plan is working as a whole. Now we want to discuss training a little bit. So if you're following, again, the regulatory requirement, we need to demonstrate that all individuals that are doing any kind of role in our food defense plan is considered qualified. And that qualification can be done by training and education in our facilities. It can be trained by going to public seminars or receiving formal education from universities. All individuals in a facility need to receive basic food defense training so that they're aware of what our policies and programs are asking them to do. We also need to make sure that our supervisors and managers are trained, because they're more than likely the ones that are going to be required to verify and maybe even conduct corrective actions when deviations occur. So we need to make sure that they're trained and qualified in how to do that as well. So that we make sure that our food defense plan is running effectively. Now, once we've developed our vulnerability assessment and we've developed our monitoring techniques and our corrective action procedures, obviously that's going to have us create documents. Now, again, if we're required to follow the regulatory requirements or even GFSI requirements, we're going to need to prove that we're doing the things that we say we're going to do. So we're going to have to generate records. So some best practices for records are records can be or should be originals or just true copies of the original. What this really means is you don't want to make a copy of a copy of a copy because you've used whiteout, and you don't want anybody to see that you used whiteout to make corrections. You can use electronic records, but you want to make sure that electronic records reflect just like as if they would be written documents, such as a way to capture the individual that monitored the event and the individual that conducted corrective actions and verification activities. All records need to be accurate. They need to be indelible, meaning permanent, and legible, meaning readable. So if people are writing down stuff by hand, you want to make sure that it is clear and concise and anybody can understand what's being written. Records need to be conducted at the time of the event. So if I'm doing seal checks, you don't want to wait to the end of the day and then write down and say, yes, I inspected all the seals for the 15 deliveries that happened today. You want to make sure you're conducting and writing down the information at the time you're doing it. And it needs to be detailed enough to capture what you did for food defense issues. So all records should include the name of your facility and the location of your facility, specifically if you're a large company that have multiple facilities. That way that it identifies this record is for specifically your location and not the other company that's located maybe 50 to 100 miles away. You want to include the date and time that the activity is being conducted, and you want to make sure that initials or signatures of the person that's doing the activity is included. Where appropriate, you need to identify the product and production code if it's necessary for food defense purposes. Now, last, you want to make sure that you're using the team approach when conducting your vulnerability assessments and developing your food defense plan. So the team approach can help you conduct your assessments. And you want to consider building your food defense team and should be comprised of a multidisciplinary team, meaning having the team comprised of different employees from different departments. Every team needs a leader, so someone to keep everybody on track. And so that leader of the food defense team should be that qualified individual if you're following the regulatory requirement or trained and detailed on how to do an appropriate vulnerability assessment. The other members of your team are going to assist you in those departments that you might not be well versed in. These are examples of individuals you might want to consider to be part of your food defense team. Plant and facility manager, because they dictate resources that can be used for any significant vulnerabilities to assist in finances or actions that need to be done for your facility. Manager, because who knows more about your individual products than your quality managers. IT for cyber issues. And of course, you might even want to consider a dedicated frontline employee that can assist with other information you might not be aware of. Again, these are just recommendations for team members. You can choose anybody you want, but those team members can assist you in tackling this large type of thing in developing your food defense plan. So the last thing you need to do, like I mentioned earlier, is review your plan. Now, if you're following the regulatory requirement, it asks that at a minimum you review your plan every 3 years, or when activities change, like new processes, adding new equipment, and you might even want to consider when you have new management that comes into the picture. If you've identified new, or somebody else has identified new or increased vulnerabilities in either ingredients or your processes, if you get new information about a vulnerability you already considered, or if you've identified that a mitigation strategy is not working properly, like say having to do a corrective action. So, or if the FDA or USDA or any else notifies you that, hey, there's a potential hazard you might need to consider that's never been identified before. Again, you want to reanalyze your plan. So other than that, Simon, that concludes my portion of the webinar. If anyone has any specific questions, you can reach out to us at AIB International at the phone number 1-800-633-5137, or you can send an email to info@aibonline.org. And just as a small side note, and for everybody to know, we have just recently at AIB International revamped our food defense public seminar. Our first seminar is going to be January 16th and 17th in Phoenix, Arizona. And it has been revamped. If you've attended one of our seminars before, it is a totally new program, and we welcome you to come if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Earl, for a very concise and clear and informative presentation. Very enjoyable. For about 80% of it, it was very good, and there were very few technical problems. But some people, well, a number of people in the sidebar were saying that there was audio problems. But for myself, there was no audio problems whatsoever. It was no audio or visual problems at all. So maybe it's for some of the attendees. I don't know why, but hopefully, if anybody has had problems, they will. Everything will be clear on the recording. But we'll have to see. So, any questions, ladies and gents, while we've still got Earl with us? Anything related to Earl's presentation? At the moment, it's just all thanks and very good presentation. Binu's saying, Simon, thank you for arranging this very good info and look forward to the complete recording. Glenn's saying we received a blackout. Thanks for this excellence. Yes. What about the AIB contact number? Can you give that contact number again? William's asking.
Yes, I sure can.
Please.
So the 1-800-633-5137. And then also you can reach out by email at info@aibonline.org. Now, this is not just specifically for food defense, everyone. If you have food safety questions as well, or specific questions dealing with the baking industry, you can reach out and send an email to info, and they will send it to the subject matter expert in that area, and that individual will get back to you to discuss anything that you have questions on.
Okay, thanks, Earl. A few people actually, Melissa's reminded me, asked about ISO 3100. Are you aware of that standard and how it may fit with this subject?
ISO, no, I would have to research that specifically.
Okay, no problem. Well, what we can do is in the follow-up email, if we can find any information on that, whether it's links or some information, we can send that on.
That will be very easy for me to do.
And also, when we were talking about the risk assessment, a number of people were typing in and asking, is it similar to doing the HACCP, you know, where you do the product description and those types of things? It's similar to the HACCP approach.
Correct. Yeah, it is similar to the HACCP approach, but you can use it for food defense purposes to help you if you're identifying vulnerabilities. What I mean by that is the new food defense FDA regulation asks you to develop your assessment and back it up by science. So if we're identifying, like I mentioned, potential biological hazards, but we know our product, we'll say we only make vinegar. Vinegar is so acidic and there's not any known potential biological contaminants that can survive in vinegar. So I would never consider biological as a hazard in my vulnerability assessment, because I wouldn't need to worry about it, but I would still focus on chemical and the others.
Yeah, okay, that's clear. Thanks, Earl. Doris is asking, if we have CT-PAT, can we say that we have implemented food security?
Well, again, it depends on if you have to meet regulatory requirements or not. CT-PAT is a good assessment, but what this program allows you to do, it helps speed up the process of, as long as you're following the elements of this program, to allow your vehicles, like say coming from Mexico or Canada, to go through customs a lot easier because you've implemented some food defense measures in. However, it necessarily isn't a true vulnerability assessment and capturing all hazards that might be associated with your facility. It's mainly focused on transportation practices.
Okay, thanks, Earl. Alana, can you address how well, oh, that's a different subject really, how well GFSI covers the FSMA requirements? So if you've got certification to BRC or SQF, how close are you to meeting the FSMA requirements? I know it's a different topic.
Right. So in the regulation, they haven't truly come out and specify exactly what is considered a trained and qualified individual as it relates to food defense. Now, they do stipulate one small thing. I think in the near future, the FSPCA, the organization that has created the training to become a certified PCQI, I think they have also been tasked to develop a food defense program. And if you notice in the clause, it says equivalent to the type of program that's going to be generated by this organization. So in general terms, as long as you can prove that so if you have a training certificate, like say from SQF or some other body, I would keep the itinerary that was used for that training and kind of match it up when this training program is created to see if it's equivalent. And then that might be a good example of, hey, I kind of went through a similar program.
Okay, thanks. And on training again, Raluca is asking, do the operational personnel need to be trained on food defense basics?
Absolutely. Everyone in your facility should be trained on basics food defense. Now, if they're managers, supervisors, or individuals that have been tasked to do a mitigation strategy, or even the food defense team themselves, their training is going to need to be a little bit more in depth to capture what they're doing according to the food defense plan.
Okay, great. Your thoughts on the FDA plan builder?
So that's a good question. When the proposed rule came out, everything that was on the food defense plan builder that's currently on the FDA's website met those requirements. But when the final rule came out, they had some significant changes. In the comment section of the new regulation, they even stipulate that the food defense plan builder doesn't meet all the requirements as of yet, but they are going to update the program. And I think that's another reason why they kind of extended the compliance dates. Initially, in the proposed rule, it was 1 year for large facilities, 2 years for small facilities, and 3 years for very small facilities. Well, now they've increased it to 3 years for large facilities, 4 years for small facilities, and 5 years now for very small facilities. And I think it's because they need to update some of their programs and software.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. Camilla, just a comment, where I live in Scandinavia, this is not at all discussed. It is a big issue in all the countries. We are discussing food fraud a lot, but not food defense at all.
So that's a good question. So food defense from the US side was initially considered in the proposed rule for food defense. But then when the final rule came out, and when the final rule came out for the preventative controls rule for human food, we decided to put food fraud as an assessment part in the food safety plan because of the intent. To do food fraud, it's not to kill people or to intentionally adulterate product, it's to make a quick buck. Yeah. And so that's why we decided to put there, but it is still something I understand that's very important for Europe and agencies overseas. I've seen the big news stories. There's nothing wrong with putting it in your food defense assessment, and I have some, and it's a good thing to consider, especially with your ingredients.
Okay, just flipping back to training again of operational personnel, following on, what types of things would you include in there? I know one would be perhaps what to look out for, what to be aware of, so what would you include in basic food defense awareness training for all personnel?
So I would train just basic security measures. One, obviously, to look out for people. So like we said, we need to consider an insider that we've welcomed into our facility. I'll give one example. Our pest control specialist, usually if we have a contracted pest control specialist, that's one of the individuals that we allow to go everywhere in our facility. And in most cases, we're not following them. So we want to make sure that people that are working around the areas that he or she comes around, that we're paying attention to what they're doing so that they might not be walking over to production equipment when all they're supposed to be doing is servicing our pest control stations. Or if we have contractors in doing revamping our equipment or processes, that they're staying in their areas and not just wandering all over the place in our facilities. So basic training like that for our employees. Also, not leaving doors propped open when we go out and take breaks or things like that. Again, these are some things to consider in basic training for food defense.
Okay, super. The questions are just coming in, and you're doing a great job fielding them, but we are on the time now. I think we agreed anyway, what we would do is we'd collate all these questions and we'd follow up perhaps by email, you know, with typed answers as a follow-up. But there is a lot of interest in this, Earl, and people are asking again how they about the course you've got running in January.
Yes, correct.
What date's that again?
January 16th and 17th. It's in Phoenix, Arizona. That's the first seminar. We have multiple seminars planned throughout the year. If you want more specifics, you can go to our AIB International website, and we have all of our public seminars, not just food defense, but the FSPCA's Preventative Controls for Human Food Rural Certificate Training, and other food safety classes that we give. That schedule is available on our website, and it even lets you know how you can register for those classes if you'd like.
Okay, fantastic. Right. Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll probably put links to those relevant pages on the AIB website in the follow-up email so they can go directly to those specific courses that are coming up. So I've really enjoyed today. If there was any technical difficulties, I'm sure it's recorded okay, so not to worry, but you've done a great job today. And I think your title is Subject Matter Expert Food Defense for AIB International. You've certainly proved that today, Earl. You're definitely an expert on the topic, and it's been one of the most the most comments I've seen in a webinar, so thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Simon. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and your audience. I really enjoyed the opportunity.
Great, and I hope to see you in next year's program, perhaps.
I'd love to.
Yeah, it'd be great to have you back. So have a great Christmas, and I'll speak to you soon, Earl.
All right, thanks. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Okay, ladies and gents, if you did have problems, not to worry. As you know, live streaming is fraught with all sorts of problems. It is recorded. We'll be sending you an email with the webinar recording, the presentation slides, your certificate, and links that we've talked about. And also, we'll send the questions to Earl and the team at AIB. They'll type their answers to those questions, and we'll send another email with those, so you'll have everything that you need. Can't say fairer than that for 1 hour of free education on a Friday. I've loaded your certificate in the sidebar. All I'd like to say is this is the last webinar of the Food Safety Fridays for 2016. We've done 30 this year, and we did 30 in 2015, so we've done 60 in all. You know, it's sad, it's the last one of the year, but don't worry, we're back next year, 2017, with another 30 webinars. So lots of new topics, lots of new speakers. So I'd just like to say thanks to the sponsors again, Trace Analytics, Metal of Toledo, Safe Food 360, and FSSC 22000. Thanks to all the presenters, such as Earl today, who give their time and knowledge freely. And thanks also to you, the attendees. You know, we're regularly getting 1,500, around 1,500 subscribers now to each webinar, and you really join in and make these webinars engaging for everybody. So thanks for all your participation, and I hope to see you next year. Wish you all the best. If you're celebrating Christmas, have a great holiday, and I'll see you next year. Enjoy your weekend. Take care.